Thank you. I want to acknowledge Brad Coquelet's contributions to this project, both in the proposal and in the working out of it. He was unable to be with us due to other commitments, of which he has many, so he said, you can go and face the audience on your own. It'll be fine. We're doing a really fun project. Now, the thing about Brad and I is we've known each other a long time, and we've been working together already for a long time, so we're kind of fortunate when it came to a grant opportunity that really wanted a lot of deep integration, because we were already pretty far down the road. And I know that that's a struggle. We have our own struggles, but we were pretty fortunate with that. So I'm very appreciative of him and his efforts. Also, I want to acknowledge Jean-Philippe Laurenceau as one of our co-investigators. He's an expert in multi-level modeling, which we very much need. So I'm just going to show a conception of virtue traits. These traits, or these features, are going to be pretty familiar to you, maybe different words. We're focused primarily on the proper motivation, behavioral manifestation, and self-integration of the virtues, but we're also extremely interested in the idea of virtues being habitual, and also aimed towards choice-worthy ends. And then another one that's important to us is this idea that virtues manifest in degrees. So in some of the philosophical literature, it seems to be almost an all or none thing. So it's one of the things that we're very interested in, is looking at the manifestation of virtue in degrees. So we're not going to do very much with the knowledge-based or the situational appropriateness. You have to sort of figure out what you can and can't do in one single project. So just so you know, we're not going to be dealing much with that, although we do have some situational variables. So in contrast with, at least in my world, the common approach to virtue research is to use self-report scales, single time point, and looking at global characteristics. And I think that's a valuable approach. It's one that it's a good place to start. It's a good place to get a lot of information, to generate hypotheses and so on. But it clearly has some important limitations in that you really can't get at the habitual nature of a trait. You can't really demonstrate traitness very well, because traitness is something that should show up over time. So that's part of what we're going to do. There are other limitations of self-report that we're all well aware of. So we decided to use three methods, and one of the things that's characteristic of this group and of many of the individual projects in the group is using more than one method. And I think that's a real strength, because we all know that any given method has a lot of liabilities and shortcomings, and what we can try to do is triangulate, if we're doing empirical research, through a variety of methods to try to get a better picture of what we're studying. So we're going to use our main study is an experience sampling method study. And the big advantage of experience sampling, everybody knows from Will and Aranda's talk what that is, right? Do I need to say any more about that? I was so happy to see that you were going to explain all that. And I could just say, yeah, what they said. So that was great. But the main advantage of it is you can look at within-person variation over time, and that's something you can't do when you do single time point studies. And you need at least 5 data points to do that effectively. Most of us do many, many more than 5, because we want to be able to model that change a little more elaborately and clearly. So that's one way that we're trying to get past this common approach. The second one is we decided to do narrative interviews. The problem with ESM studies is that they're very short. You almost never go beyond a month with those if you do a daily diary. If you do multiple times a day, you can only annoy people for so long, and then you have to let them go and tell them thank you. With narrative interviews, we can get a bigger picture of virtues as traits and how they fit into a whole life. And so from an Aristotelian perspective, flourishing and virtue are matters of our entire lives and how our whole lives come together. So we want to at least dip our toes into that world. We're not going to do anything nearly as wonderful as what Jack and his group is doing in terms of the breadth and the depth of the interviews, but we want to do something with that so that we flesh out what we're finding in the ESM study. And then finally, we want to do something that involves observed behavior. So we're using some experimental methods to do that, so that even though ESM and narrative interviews get beyond self-report scales, they're still self-report. So even if they're reporting on their behavior, they're still saying what they think they did, rather than where we can say, we're going to observe a behavior that we think manifests fairness or we think manifests kindness, and see how often and to what degree that happens. So we included experimental studies. So with our ESM study, the study design, we're going to have a pre-ESM survey where we're going to ask about social desirability. We're going to get a baseline for eudaimonic well-being and hedonic well-being. We're going to do the Big Five inventory, a few things like that. And then we're going to dive into a density distribution approach, and it follows very much along the lines of what Will and Arenda talked about. The basic model is very much what they talked about. Looking for different levels of traits across people, looking at variation within people, and so forth. We're going to do a 14-day intensive longitudinal design with four data collection points per day. And this is going to come by random prompts. So we'll just prompt people 4 times. We'll divide the day into 3-hour blocks, and they'll get a prompt sometime within those 3 hours. We want to do that to try to approximate a fairly random sample of their behavior. So it's not always at the same time of day, is the idea there. We're going to be focused only on kindness and fairness. And as it is, we have probably maybe too many questions. We're still working that out. And then we're going to have a 6-month follow-up. We want to see to what degree do the traits that we observe show up in subsequent well-being. Now, in previous studies, there are 2 that have used this method with virtues. One is the one that was discussed yesterday. And one of the creative things that this group did was to use euphemism and dysphemism items as a way to get around the social desirability problem, which I thought was really cool. And then they studied 4 virtues. So a euphemism is saying something that's not so great in a good way, and a dysphemism is saying something that sounds good in a kind of crummy way. So, so would you identify as someone who sometimes, what was it, is evolutionarily unfit enough to be honest in certain circumstances, or something like that? So very creative. And then a second study by Blydorn and Dennison, and they used modified via items, and they turned them into bipolar adjectives. And they focused on 2 setting variables, whether the person was at work or engaged in parenting. And they had a big list of virtues that they looked at. And what we took from we took many things from these 2 studies. One is that you can do this. This is viable. This is something worth doing. The second thing we took is in both studies, it looked like social desirability was not driving the responses. Okay, it's just like they showed with the distribution. There is a distribution of responses. People are willing to say that I didn't act particularly virtuous on that occasion. And that's another great thing about intensive sampling is that you're asking people about short periods of time, so we're much more likely to say, oh, I wasn't that fair in the last couple of hours, and I don't have to say, I'm not fair in general, I'm not a fair person. So it makes it a little bit easier. So we're going to try to build on this by using more ordinary language questions and focusing on a broader range of settings and focusing on the relationship of the people with whom the respondents are interacting. So what we've done mostly is item development. And I'm going to give you a deep sigh, also known as deep integration. In spite of Brad and my really good relationship, and some of you know him, he's one of the most congenial people on the planet. We spent a lot of time developing the items for this study. So we met weekly over about a 3-month period of hashing out, thinking through, revising, conceptually defining, all of that. So we had a research team approach, and the big first question was the construct definition. How are we going to define what it is we're studying? There are any number of definitions of justice, as we know, or fairness, any number of definitions of kindness or helpfulness. So we spent a long time doing that. And that was one of the ways in which Brad was particularly helpful because, of course, philosophers are really good at parsing words and concepts. And so it really helped us to think through this and to be very, very deliberate about it. So we spent a good amount of time doing that. Then in between some of these sessions, we'd actually try to generate items, bring the items back to the group, talk about them, and then edit the items and revise them. And it was an iterative process that, as I say, took several months to do. And we came up with a set of items. So we have a set of fairness items, and it begins with asking whether in the last 2 hours you had a chance to balance your needs interests or wishes with those of another person. And so we asked the participants this, and then we have a set of items that some of them are deal with behaviors, some of them deal with motivation, and some of them deal with self-processes. So the idea with the two different motivational sets of items, one is in terms of goals. What's my goal in this particular interaction? The other one is more felt motivation. How engaged or involved was I with this? So was this engaging in the moment, motivating in the moment? And then the two self-processes, the first one is from Sheldon Kennan's self-concordance scale. We modified it to fit an ESM format and to ask the questions in the way that we wanted to. He said it's okay if we use a scale. I'm still not sure if he's okay with us citing him in using the modification of his scale. Anybody know Ken? He's a great guy. Yes. Okay, and then the other one is just simple self-consistency. How consistent do I think this is with how I operate all the time? Then we have a similar set of fairness or kindness items and the same basic structure. And so we went about this in the same way. So we just worked our way through each of these sets of items as a way to try to get a bigger picture of what we're looking at. And so we'll be able to ask questions about how much does the behavior, motivation, and self-concordance line up within individuals over time. That's our main interest. How many of you have been on committees? This was a committee, right? And it was a committee of some graduate students, a philosopher, and a psychologist. And you know how committee decisions work. Have you ever been asked to explain a committee decision? You know the answer, right? Blah, 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 blah. That's how you explain committee decisions. So we were a little nervous about what we come up with. You know, I realized I should have gotten one of those committee design an elephant pictures to put here. But if I just say that, you've seen it, you know what I mean. So even better, you can use your imagination. So we were nervous about it. So what we did is we did a cognitive interview study. This wasn't part of our original proposal, but we just felt like it would be worth the time to give these items to some participants and see if they understand what we're asking. Because it's possible they wouldn't understand what the heck we're asking. Or they would think we were asking A when we really meant B. And so we wanted to do that. So we got a set of participants to take the ESM just one time. And then one of my research assistants sat down with them and talked to them for about an hour, hour and a half about how they read the items, what they meant to them, what their experience of it was. And of the about 28 or 30 items, we revised 15 as a result of the cognitive interview study. So one of the things I'm really grateful for about this grant is having the funding and being able to pay my students to spend their time being extremely careful about developing the measurement. Now, we still might get bupkis, who knows? That's how research goes. But I'm a lot more confident because we've been so deliberate and careful. So the funding really, really helps with that. So thank you. So what we're doing now is we're in the midst of piloting these in an ESM format. So we're going to do 2 7-day studies. The first one is with 20 undergraduate students. We've started to get data with that, or not started, but we have most of the data for that. And we're getting some interesting responses, and we may need to do some more revising. And then we're going to get another sample of 20 community members, and Qualtrics is going to recruit that sample for us, so we're not limited geographically or by any other real serious bias, only by the bias of who's willing to work for Qualtrics for peanuts, right? If you know how Qualtrics works, that's our bias. Then with that, our plan is to do item and scale assessments and revisions as necessary. And then we're going to do a power analysis, because one of the funky things about ESM is, and if you're working in an area that there isn't a well-established effect size, you're not sure how many people you need. So we're going to take a real close look at that. The only way you can really know how many people you need or get a good estimate of it is if you have data on exactly what you're doing. And so that's what we're going to do. So again, it's another way in which the funding helps us to take a little bit more time, be a little bit more deliberate, not feel like we have to rush into getting data. We're using a company called MetricWire. I saw that one of the other groups had a different software that they were using for this. MetricWire allows us the people put an app on their phone, and they can work on the question. They'll get the prompts, and they can work on the questionnaires whether or not they have a phone signal. And that was the big selling point for me, is that it wouldn't be delayed by being out of service. And that's been really reinforced for me here because T-Mobile has crap service on this campus. I'm currently in trouble with my wife because I had no service and I was in my pajamas, and I was trying to decide, was it worth putting my clothes back on to get service to call my wife last night, and I decided not to, and I'll make it up to her. All right, so that's the method what we're using. So the study again, here are the ESM items. So this is what comes up. This is not the first question, but it's one of the questions. It's the first question for the kindness portion about whether or not they offered help. And then they put in the person's name if they did, so that then the name can be piped in all the way through. So it makes it more immediate and more personal and clearer to the person what it is that we're asking them.
What happens if they say no?
If they say no, they put in NA, and then it goes NA all the way through. And then, yeah, at the bottom here you can see that it says not applicable. What we wanted to do is make it so that people had to go all the way through the survey whether or not they said they offered help or whether or not they had to balance their needs. Because if you don't, you set up an incentive for people to say no. We do not want to have that incentive. So, but we spend a lot of time when, my graduate assistant who worked with the pilot sample spent 30 minutes at least with each participant, coaching them, guiding them, explaining to them what we're doing, because this can get actually pretty obnoxious. You can imagine doing this 4 times a day for 2 weeks. So we jolly them along, and we thank them, and we explain to them why we're doing what we're doing as a way to help them feel more committed to the process. And that seems to have made quite a difference. We only lost maybe 1 or 2 people in our pilot sample. And then we're asking about context. So we want to know, that's one of our big questions, and this is one of the contributions that Brad made, having read Alistair McIntyre's view that it may be nearly impossible to cultivate virtues in the fractured, difficult, complex world in which we live. And so one of Brad's questions, and I think it's a good one, is virtue fractured for us? Can we demonstrate similar virtues across many contexts and in many relationships, or does it tend to show up more at home, or more at work, or more at church or something? So that's one of the questions we'll be asking. And then this one is a behavioral item. How much effort did you put in? There are 4. This is just one of them. This is a goal motivation item. How important was it to be helpful? And you notice we're not asking idiosyncratic goals. We're not asking the participants for what specific goal do you have. We're asking about their goal motivation. This is a felt motivation goal. How engaged did you feel? And then this is one of the self-concordance items. This is the first one in the scale. So the way it's set up is the first 2 ask about, if you answer yes or a high score, it means that it's not very self-concordant. You're doing it because someone else wants you to, or you think you should. And the last 2 are more about internal motivation, and so you just reverse score the first 2 to get an overall score. So that's an example of what the ESM looks like. And then again, the main study, we have the pre-survey study, 14 days. We think we need about 80 people. That's a reasonable estimate. It's about what people seem to use. If we find out with our power analysis we need 100, we'll get 100. If we find out we need 60, we'll still get 80. Just to not be too nervous. We're going to stratify it by sex and age, so we're going to have adults from 25 to 60 instead of have a college sample or a young adult sample. And we expect the maximum number of observations is 4,480. So you can see it's a very intensive method, and that's not even counting individual questions. That's 4,480 times people will be asked to respond to this overall. So it's very data intensive. And as I said, we're going to do a 6-month follow-up, and we're going to look at do the things that we find and how people describe their activities predict their well-being going forward. So we've got a set of hypotheses. The first one is that the standard one with density distribution is that we're expecting within and between person variation in all 3 of the relevant things that we're interested in. And that has been very successful both in personality trait studies and in virtue trait studies, so we're pretty confident we'll find that. And that's of interest because that's 2 of the things you need to be able to establish traitness. Short of that, it's very difficult to say that you've really identified and measured a trait. And then we expect strong person consistency over time. Again, this has been demonstrated in previous studies, so we're pretty confident in this. And that's another thing we need to demonstrate traits, is that it's something that people do regularly, more or less over time. And then we think that we're going to find strong within-person correlations between behavior, motivation, and self-processes. Now I'm going to anticipate a question I'm sure somebody's going to ask, so I'm sorry if you were hoping to ask this. But one of the possibilities is we don't have three different things. We only have one thing. Okay, so we're going to have to take a look at that and see if we can reasonably say that these are three different things that correlate in an interesting way, or do we really just have one thing we're measuring, and so we can't really talk about those correlations don't mean much. And that's, as anyone who's done this kind of work knows, is a matter of degree, and you kind of say, well, maybe this, maybe that. It's kind of more this, more that. But that's something that we will look at. Some more primary hypotheses is we're expecting differences in these across public and private settings, or at least we're saying we're going to look at that. We're not entirely sure how that's going to happen. That's a pretty open hypothesis. McIntyre thinks we will find yes. We're not as sure. Now, Blydorn and Dennison in their study did find yes, but what they interestingly found is that justice and wisdom, and I've forgotten which other ones, were more prevalent in work settings, and the more interpersonal relationships, more interpersonal virtues were more prevalent in home settings. So you almost found a bifurcation of where they're prevalent. Now, that doesn't mean they don't happen in both settings, but it's just a little more likely in one or the other. So we're not entirely sure what we'll see there. Then we're also interested in whether we see differences based on the relationship that the person has with the one that they're interacting with. And we're finding that quite a number of people report on interactions with strangers, so they don't even know their names. So that's a pretty interesting subset. So we're hoping to have some very interesting comparisons there. And then finally, we're thinking that these trait measures will predict eudaimonic well-being in a later follow-up. Okay. All right, now that's where we are so far. We're actually busily looking at our pilot data now, so we didn't get quite to the point where I could tell you much about that, unfortunately. But we do have some other studies that we have in mind. The next one is going to be a narrative, well, I'm not sure how it's going to go sequentially, but another one is this narrative interview study. And what we're going to do is we're going to do extreme case sampling from our ESM sample. And we're going to choose 5 of the people who tended to score pretty highly on the virtue measures, and 5 of the people who tended to score fairly low on those, so that we can get a contrast in how they tell their stories, what these traits mean to them, what they learned about them, what some of the critical incidents were for them in learning about kindness or fairness. And so I'm pretty excited about that. I think it'll be really interesting to take a look at. And then the other study we're going to do is a fairness experimental study. And so we're going to set it up so that we get, again, an observable behavior that we think could stand in for fairness in such a way that we could say, okay, given that these people describe themselves as fair, their behavior reflects that. And that's pretty rare in the literature. What we're going to do is use a minimal group paradigm. So some of you may not know what that is. What's really interesting about human beings is it's really easy to get us to identify with a group. All we need is the slightest reason to do so, and bam, we're there. So one of the ways that people do this is they have them look at some abstract paintings, and they say, oh, you're in the Kandinsky group. Most people can't recognize a Kandinsky, right? And they tell some other people you're in this other group, so you have in-groups, and people act toward their in-group members differently than they act toward their out-group members. So that's simple. You could also say, oh, you're here because you're a psychology major, and we have another group of people who's here because they're chemistry majors. We've sampled from both departments, and we want to look at, how do people act? And so we got these 2 samples, and you'll be interacting with someone from the psychology department, same department, or from the chemistry department, different department. People will act differently, reliably. So it's a very powerful effect. So we're going to set that up. And then we're going to have them do a dictator game. And a dictator game is where the participant is given a sum of money, and they have the option of dividing that money between themselves and someone else in any way they want. They can keep 100% of the money, they could give 100% to the other person, or they could split it evenly, or in any way they want to. So it's a very simple procedure. But we will have done some measurement ahead of time. We'll give them the big 5, and we'll probably give them an extensive list of items to hide that we're asking them about their fairness trait. And then what we're expecting to find is an interaction. The standard thing that you see is people will give more. So this is how much, what percentage they give to the other person. They'll give more in the in-group than the out-group. That's pretty standard. But we expect people who score higher on fairness to give a more similar amount in both groups. People lower in fairness will do the more standard, have the more standard difference in giving across in-group and out-group. Okay, so that's our experimental demonstration. Okay, now I wanted to talk a little bit about the facilitators of deep integration and the challenges of deep integration that we found. One of our deliverables, by the way, part of the reason I'm doing this is that this is something we actually did. So we said that we would do a series of workshops at the University of Miami. One of them is on intensive longitudinal research, and the other one was on interdisciplinary research. So we did spend some time thinking about this, reflecting on our own process, reading the National Science Foundation study on this. If you don't know, there's a big study that they did, very interesting. So for us, I already mentioned the fortunate history we have. So Brad and I know each other. We co-hosted a conference on eudaimonia in 2011. Which was really, really fun. It was one of my first good experiences with interdisciplinary meetings, but I have to tell you that I've had much better experiences since, both here and through the Jubilee Center in England. And so I think that that's a very promising thing to me, that we're able to speak to each other better, more respectfully, more openly, with greater interest, finding more common ground. I think that's a really great thing. But in our personal relationship, we have that history already. Also, we had a mutual desire to overcome disciplinary boundaries, and I think we've heard a lot about how hard that is. And sometimes it's disciplinary, sometimes it's just perspective, differences in perspectives. And so you have to have a real interest in doing that because it's hard. It takes time, it takes patience. Now, fortunately for us, again, I think we have some benefits here because moral philosophy has a lot to say about virtue and flourishing. Psychology has more and more to say about it. More and more psychologists are interested. We're developing a language and a method for studying these things. And then by the same token, both philosophy and psychology have quite a lot to say about moral psychology. And that's really important to both disciplines. It's not something that's just, well, what the heck, you're interested in that, great, go do it. Both disciplines are very interested in it. So it gives us some very nice common ground to work with. The other thing we discovered is, like a good marriage, interdisciplinary collaboration is never 50-50. Now in marriage, when I talk to audiences, I say it's 100-100 because you've got to be able to meet each other way more than halfway, because some days one of you can't go halfway. It's just not going to happen. So you have to be able to do that. And I think that's true. And with us, I think what's been helpful is I'm a psychologist who's been reading philosophy for decades. I'm not a philosopher, and I'm a bit of a hack, and people correct me all the time, and I say thank you, thank you. At my best, I say thank you. Sometimes I argue, but mostly I say thank you. And Brad is a philosopher who's read a lot of psychology and is extremely interested in empirical psychology, and that's the new thing in philosophy I think is very cool. The interest in what we can know from the empirical research. We're both very committed to the project. We both value each other's opinion and value each other as individuals. And then finally, lastly but not least, glue money. So one of the things that keeps a project going is that you have support for it. Now that can be administrative support. We don't have any of that. But we do have funding that helps us to do what we do and gives us a real strong incentive to continue. In terms of challenges, I think we all face these to some extent, and this is one of the biggest ones, disciplinary snobbery. Now, here's another way that I'm fortunate. How many of you are in psychology departments? Okay. In those psychology departments, how often is your work on virtue celebrated in your department? Okay, we've got a couple of maybes, yeah. So that's an example of disciplinary snobbery. Now, I happen to be in an educational psychology department, and I have very broad-minded colleagues because we do a lot of different things, and so there isn't a strong expectation of a single normative approach to things. And so I think for some people that's a huge obstacle. I think for Brad it was a huge obstacle because his colleague said to him more than once, it's great that you're friends with Blaine, but don't spend too much time with him. You know? That's not going to get you anything. That's not going to get you anywhere. And it's their way of saying that the real work is philosophical research, and the psychology stuff is, you know, could be a hobby, but don't spend much time on it. It requires a lot of time and patience. We've actually heard a lot about that already. Here's another one. It requires ignorance exposure. I have to be willing to expose my ignorance. He has to be willing to expose his ignorance. And that's maybe what we need is to have Bob come around and talk to us all about humility a lot so that we're get more comfortable with that, right? But as academics, it's not fun to say you don't know something a lot of times. And particularly in academic discussions, none of us, you know, it's uncomfortable to say, well, I don't know anything about that. We can do it, but it's something you have to establish. There's a lack of established framework, so that's that thing about all of us having to figure out how do we do this together? How do we make this work? What's the way we think about it? Now, unfortunately, he and I are going to be faced with the physical distance that some people have talked about that makes it more challenging. It's so much easier to do this face-to-face. Hey, can we meet on Wednesday? Sure, let's get coffee, or sure, we'll meet in this room. Very easy to do. So we'll have to work at that a little bit more. Some of you know, some of you don't know, Brad's leaving the University of Miami, so that was one of the things that made things much easier, and now it's going to get a little bit harder. And then, oh, that was it. I'm sure there are more challenges. I thought I added more, but you could probably tell me if I asked you for volunteer instances. Okay, so in terms of our deliverables, I mentioned to you that we did these 2 workshops at the University of Miami. We did one on intensive longitudinal research. Now that was a 3-day workshop, and Jean-Philippe came down and just walked us through that in a step-by-step way. Oh, I should have brought his book. If any of you are interested in that and want to learn more about it, he has a book. It's called Intensive Longitudinal Methods, and it's really great for people who aren't statisticians. And that's what he and his colleague, Neil Bolger, wrote it for people like most of us, that we don't know this stuff inside and out, and you can get a very good handle on it and actually be prepared to even do something if you have somebody you can lean on to help you with it. And then you can learn as you actually practice it. We also did a workshop on interdisciplinary research, and we had one refugee of a very unfortunate interdisciplinary experience where she had felt kind of ripped off and disrespected, and almost as though people took what she had to offer, didn't even say thank you, and left, and nothing came back. So it is risky, and I think that one of the main things we talked about and we thought about talking about in advance is the idea of trust. This is a relationship, and the relationship is paramount. The content is important, but if you don't have a trusting relationship, the content won't go very far. And she had a very, unfortunately, negative experience in this respect. Okay. And then we had another person that was there, was a statistician who was a little bit tired of being asked to come in at the last part of a project to do mathematical miracles, yeah, and magic. So we talked a lot about, again, setting things up, preparing, creating a relationship, something that would carry you through a whole project. Another deliverable we promised was a blog, which was kind of a real leap into darkness for me. I had no idea about this. I knew people did it. Didn't even honestly read blogs before this. Now I've started to read some, partly to see what's doing and partly because now it's on my radar screen. And Christian Miller had a blog called Questions of Character on Psychology Today that was basically he wasn't writing for it. And so Brad talked to him. He said, sure, use that. And the Psychology Today people were happy with that. So we decided to use it. So I wrote the first one called Why We Love Virtue Even If We Don't Know That We Do. And being a newbie and being, just kind of, an academic who, if 10 people read your article, you're pretty happy. Or if you get to 100, it's really great. Well, got 1,000 reads on this. I thought that was really cool. I mean, how many times do people read 1,000 different people read what we write? Pretty cool, great. So then my student wrote, what makes a person kind? And that got 15,000 hits. Well, more humility, I need it, right? We all need it. So, anyway, it's kind of fun to do. Does anybody know how to call up this is on an Apple and I'm a PC, so can I click on that somehow to make that appear? Not that it's that important, but just so you know that it's there and I'm not just making it up. And there's a picture involved. I don't have any pictures. So it was my last ditch effort to have a picture. I'm glad I didn't try if it's like that. Okay, so it's just a little blog, and the guest author is Allie Lane, my student, and got some interesting reads. Got a couple of emails from philosophers saying, hey, what about this? Because one of the things she talks about this is a study that we did before. Yeah, we can probably go back to the PowerPoint yet. Don't want people reading that while I'm talking. I'm here. So, but the question, one of the things she talked about two studies that we've done already. One was a kindness experimental study in which we set it up to be just like a situationist study where they have 3 different conditions. Sometimes you have 2, sometimes you have 3, sometimes more, where we had people in a positive mood condition, a neutral mood condition, and a negative mood condition, and they'll look and see how often people help. And this is a well-known form of research, and it usually follows exactly what you'd expect. Positive mood, more helping; negative mood, less helping. But we also measured people's kindness trait with just, again, a self-report questionnaire, and we measured their Big Five. And we wanted to see, our thinking was it was possible, the most likely candidate for predicting helping would be agreeableness on the Big Five side and kindness on the virtue trait side. And this was a student's dissertation, and he actually only had one finding, and the finding was that kindness predicted helping. Condition didn't. And so what our conclusion was that our helping task was just too easy. Because it was very skewed. There was a lot of helping that happened. So what we need to do is make more demanding helping tasks to try this again. The other study that she wrote about in there that piqued people's interest is a meta-analysis of the situational determinist literature. And that, in a way, it's an empirical way of responding to John Doris, who, as we all know, said there isn't such a thing as character. And he cites all this social psychology literature. So what we did is said, okay, let's have a look at that social psychology literature and see if it says what Doris says it says. And by the way, see if it says what social psychologists say it says. So I hope I don't make any enemies here. What we found is that indeed it does say that, but the literature says some things that are quite different from that. Now, I didn't plan to talk about this, but now that I'm into it, I don't think I can say stop. Here's what it said. What we looked at is not just were there mean differences between these conditions, which is almost the only thing that people look at in these studies. We looked at how much helping happened when there was no situational manipulation, how much helping happened when there was actually a disincentive to helping or something that should impede helping. Here's what we found. A little over half the people across 286 studies help in the positive condition, the condition that should encourage helping. And so what we know from that is these conditions are not sufficient conditions to induce helping because almost half the people didn't help in those conditions. Then in the neutral and the negative conditions, people helped around 48% and around 42%. So you get a lot of helping in these other conditions. So what that tells us is that help-inducing conditions are not necessary for helping. So basically what we've got is that people are generally helpful in extremely artificial situations with strangers where there's no consequences to it. And if you look at, there was very interesting literature on helping that involves bystanders in particular. And what happens is we all know the bystander effect, right? People are there. You're less likely to help, distributed responsibility. There's a bunch of explanations for that. But there's a caveat with that, too. There's a great meta-analysis by Fisher on this, where what he and his colleagues found is that, yes, that's true if those people are strangers and if the stakes are low. When you look across these studies, when the stakes are higher, the bystander effect goes down dramatically. And if you know the people who are other bystanders, the effect goes down dramatically. So, sorry, John, Doris, it doesn't say what you thought it said. So those were the things that I think, some of the things that really got people's attention. But just a lot of people are wondering, you know, what makes people kind, what makes people unkind, and so forth. So we are going to do the standard thing and present our results, and we're going to try to publish our results. We hope we have some really nice things to say. But that's, the check's in the mail on that one. So that's our research. We're trying to approach this from a multi-method perspective so we can get different looks at it, and hopefully we'll be able to have something interesting to say about fairness and kindness based on its traitness, based on its integration in, or lack of integration in people's lives, and based on their behavior that we can actually observe in a controlled condition, controlled situation. So we're hoping that these things will contribute to the understanding of virtues as properly motivated, self-integrated traits.
Thanks very much, Blaine. Really interesting stuff. I just had a question. I have a lot of interest in what you're doing. It's, I'm wondering about the dictator paradigm, the task, and about its relation to fairness, because it's been used to kind of quantify disposition to giving, maybe akin to generosity. And to begin with, just leaving aside the intergroup differences, I mean, how do you decide what is fair to do if you're the dictator with $10, say? And because in the one hand, if you say, well, okay, it's if you're in the intergroup condition, well, maybe I give nothing to both groups. That's treating them equally. Is that fair? And the question really is...
Before you go on, they only respond once. They don't respond to both in-group and out-group.
Right, and that's what I was going to suggest, that maybe there could be some other conditions where it's a sort of, before you do the minimal group assignment, you get a sense of what they're going to do when they don't have that kind of association. So so you get you get a sense of what they're disposed to do, right? In terms of their individual differences in, because again, and maybe you could help me understand, what do you guys expect is fair to do if I'm faced with, I have 10, that person has nothing. Is fairness giving them 5? Is fairness giving them 8 because I got it first and they didn't have a chance to get? I mean, what is fair? Is fairness just giving them something? That's what I'm wondering about with regard to the dictator game and fairness.
Right. I think those are fair questions. And our interpretation of fairness has been balancing my needs or wishes or desires with the other person's. So that would lead us to think of an equal distribution would be more toward fair based on that definition. Now, it's not the only way to think about it. It's not the only definition. And certainly the dictator game is not the only way to approach this. So we're still in the process of planning this study. That's our original plan. So if people have better ideas, I'm wide open to hearing them. Because there are lots of people in this room who have done a lot more experimental research than I have. So this is a very late development for me. It's kind of interesting.
Blaine, thanks so much. Question from a complete novice here.
Okay.
So if I understood this correctly, I would worry that the ESM study, by continually asking people about helping, is priming them to, in various ways that would be problematic.
It's an excellent question. That's not a novice question at all. That's something that ESM researchers or intensive longitudinal researchers in general worry about. Is the idea it's called reactivity. And then if you're actually priming them, what you expect is that there'll be a correlation between time point 1 and time point 2, or time point 30 and time point 31. It's called an autocorrelation. There are part of the standard analyses that you do is to assess for autocorrelation and make sure that that's not a terrible problem. And if it is, then you figure out how to deal with it.
So if it is, are there ways to adjust for it?
There are some ways, but it's a, yeah.
If it's a problem, it could be a big problem.
It could be, yeah. I mean, it doesn't tend to be. That's the other thing is, in general, it doesn't tend to prime in the way we think it might. But you can assess for it, and there are adjustments, but they're above my pay grade. The adjustments. I know about autocorrelation and assessing for it, but I don't know what to do if you find it.
Hi, Blaine. Thanks for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and I'm excited to see the results. You may have just addressed this. I got a little distracted with the mic change, but I'm curious if you think the ESM questions and surveys is going to function like some kind of intervention that leads the people to behave more pro-socially, endorse more values. You might have just addressed this.
It's similar, yeah, the priming. It is one of the worries, and it makes sense that it might, particularly the repetitive nature of it. But again, what people tend to find is that there is a range of responses, and that people don't seem to respond entirely consistently. In fact, there's what Will and his colleagues have found is that there's often more variation within individuals than there is between individuals. So that gives us some confidence that this isn't an overwhelming problem.
Do you have any way of looking at like pre-post changes?
Well, yeah, it's what I was talking about with the autocorrelation thing is one of the clearest ways to test for that. And if you're seeing a lot of lag effects, then you've got a problem. And if they're pervasive and powerful, then you have a real problem.
Great, very interesting. As you might guess, I love it. In terms of the autocorrelation, yeah, it's usually not too much of a problem. The one time we worried about is that we had something like a 0.03 increase in symptoms across 2 weeks with borderline personality disorder subjects. That's when we got worried about it, because it was 0.03, which when that's an increase in symptoms, you worry about that kind of thing, right? But that's the biggest you see usually of something like that size. So, but to go to the question, I love the fact that you're doing the experimental designs, because that gets rid of a lot of these. This addresses a lot of these concerns that are legitimate concerns about experience sampling, self-report, and so forth. And so I have one concern about that, and that goes back to the within-person variability thing, and that is that you're doing it just once.
Right.
And personality doesn't predict. You know, like your trait fairness is not going to predict how a person acts very well in one case, right? Because of things like that Michael is bringing up. You know, everybody's going to interpret that situation differently in terms of whether it's a fairness situation or a generosity situation or something else, or what is the fair thing to do. So it's very hard to predict how they're going to act and to relate that to some general trait. So I'm wondering if you are considering doing, say, 3 or 4 experiments, and then you can get the average of how people acted across those 3 or 4 experiments, and then relate that to their trait.
So do you give them 3 or 4 opportunities in the same session? Is that the idea? Or
Preferably in different sessions.
different
even,
sessions, yeah.
Because
Okay.
the same session, it might, time of day, or they might have just came from a pleasant event right before the session or something like that.
Yeah, one of the things I've contemplated is doing it more as an online study, where we could have them respond a few different times over time. So that is a possibility. So you're reinforcing that idea.
Okay, good.
Thank you, Blaine. So this is a question about method. So, and just informational, I think. Early on, you talked about using a technique or a procedure to tell you whether you needed to gather more data.
Right.
How does that procedure work?
The way power analysis works is you have, sometimes you do it based on an estimated effect size, that is, how strongly does variable A affect variable B, or how strongly are they correlated? And then it's relatively straightforward to look at, well, if that's the level of the relationship, then how many people do I need to have a statistically very good chance of discovering that effect? So if I have a small effect size and I only collect data with 50 people, there's a very good chance that even if that relationship exists in the data, I won't find it, because it won't be strong enough to show up as statistically reliable.
So why wouldn't one know in advance what the size should be, though? I guess I'm puzzled by that.
Yeah, because we're using new measures. We're assessing traits that have some degree of assessment, but there's not a well-established effect size. We could guess, and if we were in a hurry to do the study, that's exactly what we do. And a lot of people do that. I mean, that's a very common procedure. Most people, well, I don't know about most, but there's a lot of times people don't do pilot studies because it takes too much patience and time. But if you feel insecure, then you do pilot studies.
First a suggestion, and I'll show you this later, but other people might be interested in. I happened to participate in an event with Ernst Fair, the economist. And
They
he
do a lot of
has-
this. Yeah.
Yeah, he does a lot of this, and I think he's got some games that I heard him describe about fairness specifically that might work better than the dictator game. So
Okay.
just wanted to point, I think I found some of the stuff here. So
Okay.
that just one point might be interesting to see if I think they're pretty easy to implement.
Yeah, I'm open to different methods. I mean, that's just something that we're projecting. We haven't actually even started to plan the experimental study yet. We just know
Right.
we're doing it.
And the great thing is he's got a whole theory about how they work and so on. So it might actually work well for you. The other question I had is just a small question. So if you didn't look like you're obviously know that kindness and fairness are very sensitive to in-group, out-group distinction because that's what you're going to look at experimentally. But it didn't look like you were gathering any data that would tell you that in the ESM context. So if your people are high virtue kindness, but they just happen to have been relating only to in-group people, that might not work out so well.
Oh, it could be an alternative explanation that it was about the in-group, not
Yeah.
about the kindness trait. Yeah, that's a good point.
Maybe you could have a question, you have a lot of questions, but you could do something that kind of
Yeah.
collected that somehow.
Yeah, I mean, we do to some degree. I mean, the idea of interacting with strangers or something like that is a possibility. It doesn't get at that directly, because it could be a stranger who's also a major in my department or works at my university, so it could be construed as new. That's one of the weird things about in-groups, though, is that we have so many of them, and that there are so many ways to construe it, right? So is my in-group Miamians, Floridians, people from the United States, English speakers, right? So in-groups are a very funny thing. They're very ill-defined, typically.
Great talk, thank you. I just had a question. Have you thought about how your trait measure of kindness or fairness, how that would correlate with the moral foundations of Graham and Haidt? Their first two dimensions are basically those dimensions, and there's lots of research that have shown how these are individual differences. Have you thought about how they might correlate?
We haven't really spent a lot of time on thinking about MFT and with respect to our study, no.
Okay.
Do you have ideas about how that might be helpful or
Well, yeah, 'cause
problematic?
they've shown that, so in the political domain, that there's differences between
Yeah.
liberals and conservatives and how they map onto these 5 different dimensions. And these 2 that you're discussing are kind of universal, that everybody kind of has high trait or intuitions around
Or
care and
endorsements, at
harm
least,
and
yeah.
fairness and justice.
Yeah.
And I was just wondering if you've thought about those differences and how yours is similar or not, just curious.
I would have to say there's going to be quite a lot of similarity. I mean, we've spent some time with MFT before, but didn't really link it up with this particular project, partly because we're not looking at the other 3
Yeah.
or 5 or however many he thinks now, because it's an expanding list, which I think is good. No, we haven't really paid a lot of attention to that so far.
And then just another question. When the power analysis, when sometimes you don't have previous results, you can do bootstrap simulations and try to, if you run into that problem where you're trying to do the power analysis.
Sure, yeah.
We run into the same problem and we just did
Right.
the same thing. So.
Yeah, that's one of the ways you can go.
Yeah.
No, it's actually much more of a curiosity. You mentioned that in the pilot study, when you asked people what they thought they were answering, you ended up revising, say, 15 of your 20 questions. And I was wondering, is there any interest in talking to people who are actually in the study with your new questions? Because it could, you might find something about the way they're construing this that might still surprise you.
It could happen, but what was interesting, let me just say a little bit more about how that went and how we did the revisions. There were 2 kinds of things that happened, well, 3 kinds of things. In the simplest case, people understood and responded, and there was really no question about what the item was asking, and they immediately understood it, and they gave us an answer, and they could say why they gave that answer. Second thing that happened was that they just were confused by it, and they didn't know how to answer, and they told us that directly, and so the interviewer talked with them about what confused them. So we had a pretty good idea about what the wording problems were. And then the third one that happened is we had some people who understood it one way and some people who understood it a different way. And so we got really bimodal responses based on that. And they would tell us how they understood it. So again, we had pretty good idea about how the wording should be. Now, you know, we could do another iteration. Yeah, we could. Even an insecure person has a limit on their patience, though.
Now, I guess I was wondering also if in some ways it could tie in to their narratives about their life story, or if there's some way to build a bridge between these, like in the...
Well, yeah, okay, let me tell you another anecdote that goes directly to your question, and that is in the pilot sample, we had a couple of people who responded no to kindness every time, had essentially no variability there, which surprised us. And so my GA contacted a couple of these people, and one of them said, well, what I learned from this study is I'm not a very kind person. So there was some feedback there. So we're still thinking about that and looking into that. We may actually poll these people a little bit more about that, because a real low response rate is a little nerve-wracking about what might happen with our study.